But so far we've been talking about how to treat elders once they're in office. But let's actually take a step backwards. Let's now talk about how we should appoint elders. Okay? Remember we talked about this idea of being picky, and we're definitely going to see that beginning in verse 22. Paul says, "Do not be hasty in the laying on of hands, and do not share in the sins of others. Keep yourself pure. Stop drinking only water, and use a little wine because of your stomach and your frequent illnesses. The sins of some men are obvious, reaching the place of judgment ahead of them. The sins of others trail behind them. In the same way, good deeds are obvious, and even those that are not cannot be hidden." Now, he says some kind of interesting things here, maybe kind of hard to follow things, but to me, the key verse in this passage is verse 22. It says, "Don't be hasty in the laying on of hands." Don't be hasty in the laying on of hands. Now that seems to be a clear reference to ordaining new elders. And maybe you've seen this before. If you've been a member here at University Heights for a while, you probably have seen this. Whenever a new elder comes aboard, a man who has never served as an elder, the current elders and maybe even other people in the church lay hands on him. Now, nothing magical or mystical happens there, but the elders lay hands on this potential new elder. They pray for him. They ask God to bless him. They set him apart for ministry. So that is laying on of hands. That is ordaining a man for ministry. And Paul says, Timothy, don't be hasty in doing that. Don't be hasty in getting a new man to become an elder. Don't be hasty in laying hands on him. Don't be hasty in ordaining a new man for ministry. And why? Well, verse 22, he says, don't share in the sins of others. Keep yourself pure. And the idea here is, I think that he's saying, hey, Timothy, if you decide to bring someone onto the eldership and this man is not qualified, if he has sin in his life and you lay hands on him and you ordain him, Timothy, once he's in office, let me tell you, Timothy, there is a sense in which I hold you accountable. And you're sharing in this man's sins. He is unqualified and he is sinning, and you're to blame, Timothy. And there's a sense in which God is saying, Timothy, you're to blame. In other words, don't be hasty in the laying on of hands. Be very, very picky, okay? Slow the process down here a little bit. And then, in verse 23, the really kind of a weird comment, it's almost sort of dropped in there, this personal, it seems to me a personal piece of advice from Paul to Timothy, and he basically tells Timothy, hey, Timothy, I want you to start drinking wine, okay? It might sound like, that's a pretty weird request, telling the preacher to drink a little wine, but back then, in the first century, finding pure water, unpolluted water, water that is, able to drink, that was fairly rare. And so apparently Timothy had said, you know what, I'm not going to drink any wine, I'm not going to drink any alcohol. So he was only drinking water, but since so much of the water was impure, he was having all kinds of stomach ailments. And so Paul said, hey, drink a little wine, it's okay. And now, by the way, if you're an elder in the 21st century, we don't really have a problem with water purity, so I don't think you can use this verse to support drinking, okay? If you're going to make that decision, you're going to have to make a decision somewhere else, because verse 23 really doesn't apply to us. But then in verse 24, he returns to the topic, this idea of don't be hasty in the laying on of hands, and he says some interesting things. In verse 24, he says, the sins of some men are obvious, reaching the place of judgment ahead of them. The sins of others trail behind them. I read these verses several times, and I think I know what he's saying. I think what he's saying is that some men, when you look at their life and you're considering making them an elder, some of them, you're going to look at their life and you're immediately going to say, oh, well, they're not really qualified because they really have some sin in their life, or they're just not qualified. It's going to be obvious. But some men, it's not going to be obvious. You're going to look at them and say, well, I'm not really sure. But if you look closely, according to verse 24, some men have their sins trailing behind them. And I think what he's telling Timothy is, don't make a hasty decision. If you're not sure about a man, if it's not obvious, look close. Examine his life. Analyze it. And if there's sin in his life, you'll find it. In other words, he's not going to be qualified, right? And then in verse 25, I think he shows us the other side of the coin. He says, in the same way, good deeds are obvious, and even those that are not cannot be hidden. Now again, I read this several times, and I think I know what he's saying. I think he's saying some men, when you think about them as being a potential elder, you're going to look at their lives and say, oh yeah, no brainer. That guy, he has all kinds of good deeds. Yeah, no brainer. That guy is elder material. But other guys, you're not going to be so sure about. And I think Paul is saying again, Timothy, look close. And if you look close, if you're not sure about a guy, you might find these good deeds that can't be hidden forever. You'll find those good deeds if they're not obvious at first. Now, if we were to sum up, what is he saying here? What is he saying? Ignoring verse 23, the whole thing about drinking, what is he saying here? I think he's saying choose elders carefully. Isn't that what he's saying in these verses? Choose elders carefully. Be picky. Some of the guys you're going to consider as an elder, they're going to be obviously, no, they're not really qualified. Other guys, it's going to be obvious, wow, they are qualified. But some of the guys, you're not going to be so sure about. And so I think he's saying, check them over, analyze them, examine them closely, get out the microscope, okay? And some of the men you're going to find good deeds, in which case maybe they're qualified. Some of the men you're going to find sins, and they're not going to be qualified. I think that's what he's saying. Choose elders carefully. And remember what we said up front? Isn't that kind of what we talked about? I mean, regardless of the profession, whether it's a teacher or a coach or a supervisor at work or an elder, I mean, isn't this true across the board that you want to be kind of picky? Before you put somebody in a position of authority, you want to be kind of choosy. And that's particularly important when you're talking about the eldership. So, what has he said here? Number one, he said, choose elders carefully. Be picky on the front end. Not everybody is elder material. And we've talked about that. I think all of us can see how important that is. But just as important, don't just put them into place and walk away and ignore them. You can't do that. You have to help them. You have to support them. You have to help them to excel. And if you were to put all this together, I think our big takeaway today is this. I think our bottom line is that leadership matters. It's a cliche, but I think it really, really says it all, doesn't it? Leadership matters. Once again, you think about those great leaders. Maybe it's that great teacher or the great coach or that great boss at work. Or maybe it's been a great elder, but isn't it true that that you had to choose them carefully, right? You had to choose them carefully. Why? Because leadership matters. It matters who you put in the office. And it matters how you treat them once they're there. Leadership makes a huge difference. You're in a position of authority. And in the Church of Jesus Christ, these men are responsible for the souls of every person in the church. It's a huge responsibility. And so leadership matters. So choose them carefully on the front end. Be picky about them, okay? Don't be hasty in the laying on of hands. And more than that, once they're in office, give them what they deserve. If they deserve honor, then give them honor. If they deserve double honor, then give them double honor. If they deserve to be protected against unsubstantiated and bogus accusations, then you better protect them. You need to support them. On the other hand, if they need to be rebuked, well, rebuke them. Don't play favorites. Give them what they deserve. Why? Because leadership matters. It really matters. It matters across the board in any profession, in any organization, but it especially matters in the church.